The Dirty War, also known as the Process of National Reorganization, was the name used by the Argentine military government for a period of state terrorism in Argentina from roughly 1974 to 1983, during which military and security forces and right-wing death squads in the form of the Argentine Anticommunist Alliance hunted down and killed left-wing guerrillas, political dissidents, and anyone believed to be associated with socialism. The victims of the violence were 7,158 minus 30,000 left-wing activists, terrorists and militants, including trade unionists, students, journalists and Marxists and Peronist guerrillas and their support network in the Montoneros, believed to be 150,000 minus 250,000 strong and 60,000 strong, in the ERP, as well as alleged sympathizers. The official number of disappeared is reported to be 13,000. Some 10,000 of the disappeared were guerrillas of the Montoneros and the Marxist People's Revolutionary Army. The leftist guerrillas caused at least 6,000 casualties among the military, police forces and civilian population, according to a National Geographic magazine article in the mid-1980s. The disappeared included those thought to be a political or ideological threat to the military junta, even vaguely, and they were killed in an attempt by the junta to silence the opposition and break the determination of the guerrillas. The worst repression occurred after the guerrillas were largely defeated in 1977, when the church, labor unions, artists, intellectuals and university students and professors were targeted. The junta justified this mass terror by exaggerating the guerrilla threat, and even staged attacks to be blamed on guerrillas and used frozen dead bodies of guerrilla fighters that had been kept in storage for this purpose. Declassified documents of the Chilean secret police cite an official estimate by the Batallón de Inteligencia 601 of 22,000 killed or disappeared between 1975 and mid-1978. During this period, it was later revealed that at least 12,000 disappeared were detainees held by pen and kept in clandestine detention camps throughout Argentina before eventually being freed under diplomatic pressure. The number of people believed to have been killed or disappeared, depending on the source. In 2003, the National Commission on the Disappearance of Persons claimed the true number of disappeared to be around 13,000. After democratic government was restored, Congress passed legislation to provide compensation to victims' families. Some 11,000 Argentines as the next of kin have applied to the relevant authorities and received up to US $200,000 each as monetary compensation for the loss of loved ones during the military dictatorship. The exact chronology of the repression is still debated, however, and some sectors claim the long political war started in 1969. Trade unionists were targeted for assassination by the Peronist and Marxist guerrillas as early as 1969, and individual cases of state-sponsored terrorism against Peronism and the left can be traced back to the bombing of Plaza de Mayo and Revolution Libertadora in 1955, the Trelew massacre of 1972, the actions of the Argentine Anticommunist Alliance since 1973, and Isabel Martínez de Perón's annihilation decrees against left-wing guerrillas during Operativa Independencia in 1975, have also been suggested as dates for the beginning of the Dirty War. Overview. The military, supported by a significant part of the population in the form of the Radical Party and the Socialist Party, opposed Juan Perón's populist government and attempted a coup d'état in 1951 and two in 1955, before succeeding with one later that year known as Revolution Libertadora. After taking control, the armed forces prescribed Peronism. Soon after the coup, Peronist resistance began organizing in workplaces and trade unions, as the working classes sought economic and social improvements. Over time, as democratic rule was partially restored but promises of legalizing the expression and political liberties for Peronism were not respected, guerrilla groups began to operate in the 1960s, namely the Peronist Junta'S and the Guerrillist People's Guerrilla Army. Both were small and quickly defeated. George Ricardo Maceta, leader of the EGP, which had infiltrated into Salta province from Bolivia in 1964, is considered by some as Argentina's first, disappeared, as he went missing after the party militants' defeat in clashes with the Argentine gendarmerie. Prior to 1973, the major revolutionary groups were the Peronist Armed Forces, the Marxist-Leninist Peronist Revolutionary Armed Forces, and the Marxist-Leninist Armed Forces of Liberation. The FAL guerrillas raided Campo de Mayo in April 1969 and stole 100 assault rifles from the elite 1st Infantry Regiment Patricios. In time these armed groups consolidated, with the FAR joining the Montoneros, formerly an urban group of intellectuals and students, and the FAP and FAL being absorbed into the ERP. In 1970, Pedro Eugenio Aramburu, one of the military leaders of the 1955 coup, was kidnapped and killed by the Montoneros in its first claimed military action. In 1970, the Marxist People's Revolutionary Army was founded. By the early 1970s, leftist guerrillas kidnapped and assassinated high-ranking military and police officers almost weekly. The extreme left bombed and destroyed numerous buildings in the 1970s in its campaign against the government. These belonged chiefly to military and police hierarchies, but a number of civilian and non-governmental buildings were targeted as well, such as the Sheraton Hotel in Buenos Aires, which was bombed in 1972, killing a woman and injuring her husband. A crowded theater in downtown Buenos Aires was bombed in 1975. In 1973, as Juan Perón returned from exile, the Ezeiza massacre marked the end of the alliance between left and right-wing factions of Peronism. In 1974, Perón withdrew his support of the Montoneros shortly before his death. During the presidency of his widow Isabel, the far-right paramilitary death squad Argentine Anticommunist Alliance emerged. Armed struggle increased, and in 1975 Isabel signed a number of decrees empowering the military and the police to annihilate left-wing subversion. Most prominently the People's Revolutionary Army armed activity in the province of Tucumán. Isabel Martínez de Perón was ousted in 1976 by a military coup. According to the International Congress for Victims of Terrorism in 2010, prior to the military takeover in 1976, there were a total of 16,000 casualties of left-wing terrorism in Argentina, including civilians and military personnel. Years later in 1995, Argentine intelligence officers claimed that the ERP guerrillas were responsible for the deaths of at least 700 people, in addition to scores of attacks on police and military units, as well as kidnappings and robberies. In 1978, a powerful bomb meant to kill an Argentine admiral ripped through a 9-story apartment building, killing 3 civilians and trapping others beneath the debris. The Junta'S, led by George Rafael Videla until 1981, and then by Roberto Viola and Leopoldo Galtieri until 1983, organized and carried out strong repression of political dissidents through the government's military and security forces. They were responsible for the illegal arrests, tortures, killings or forced disappearances of an estimated 30,000 people. Assassination occurred domestically in Argentina via mass shootings and the throwing of live citizens from airplanes to death in the oceans below. Additionally, 12,000 prisoners, many of whom had not been convicted through legal processes, were detained in a network of 340 secret concentration camps located throughout Argentina. These actions against victims, called desaparecidos, because they simply disappeared without explanation, were confirmed via Argentine Navy officer Adolfo Silingo, who has publicly confessed his participation in the dirty war, stating, "We did worse things than the Nazis." The victims included armed combatants of the ERP and Montoneros guerrillas, but also trade unionists, students and left-wing activists, journalists and other intellectuals, and their families. The junta referred to their policy of suppressing opponents as the national reorganization process. However, the result of these disappearances was not submission of the opposition. It later led to a subversion of the military junta in conjunction with other causes. Argentine military and security forces also created paramilitary death squads, operating behind fronts, as supposedly independent units. Argentina coordinated actions with other South American dictatorships, as in Operation Condor. Accounts by dirty war survivors indicate that the Argentine government commonly seized innocent people who witnessed the capture of targeted individuals that occurred in public places. Physicians' reports confirm the torture endured by survivors. In 1979, U.S. President Jimmy Carter offered to accept 3,000 Penn detainees, as long as they had no terrorist background. Faced with increasing public opposition and severe economic problems, the military tried to regain popularity by occupying the disputed Falkland Islands. It lost any remaining favor in its lopsided defeat by Britain in the resulting Falklands War, and stepped aside in disgrace for the restoration of democracy. Restoration of democracy and accounting for disappeared. The democratic government of Raúl Alfonsín was elected to office in 1983. It organized the National Commission CONADEP to investigate crimes committed during the Dirty War and heard testimony from hundreds of witnesses. According to the official count of the 1984 Truth Commission, between 1976 and 1979 alone, 8,353 Argentines were killed or disappeared, and 113 were killed or disappeared at the hands of the military regime between 1980 and 1983. Documents by Chilean agents in Argentina found in 2006 report that the Argentine military had internally documented 22,000 cases of deaths and abductions from 1976 to 1978. Amnesty International reported in 1979 that 15,000 disappeared had been abducted, tortured and possibly killed by the military dictatorship up to that time. Human rights groups in Argentina often cite a figure of 30,000 disappeared. Amnesty International estimates 20,000. In 1988, the Asamblea por los Derechos Humanos published its findings on the disappearances, concluding that 12,261 people were killed or disappeared during the Dirty War. Although there is strong disagreement on the total number of missing persons, it is commonly accepted today that between 9,000 and 30,000 people, depending on the source, had been killed or disappeared. Some 8,600 disappeared in the form of Penn detainees were held by security forces in secret camps, but were eventually released under international pressure. Trial of the Junta'S. The government of Raúl Alfonsín began to develop cases against offenders. It organized a tribunal to conduct prosecution of offenders, and in 1985 the trial of the Junta'S was held. The top military officers of all the juntos were among the nearly 300 people prosecuted, and the top men were all convicted and sentenced for their crimes. This is the only Latin American example of the government conducting such trials. Threatening another coup, the military opposed subjecting more of its personnel to such trials and forced through passage of Ley de Punta final in 1986. which put a line under previous actions and ended prosecutions for crimes under the dictatorship. Fearing military uprisings against them, Argentina's first two presidents inflicted punishment only to top dirty war ex-commanders, and even then, very conservatively. Despite President Raúl Alfonsín's 1983 establishment of CONADEP, a commission to investigate the atrocities of the Dirty War, in 1986 the ley de punta final provided amnesty to dirty war acts, stating that torturers were doing their jobs. President Carlos Menem even went so far as to praise the military in their fight against subversion. Repeal of laws. In 2003 Congress repealed the pardon laws, and in 2005 the Argentine Supreme Court ruled they were unconstitutional. The government reopened investigations and began prosecutions again of the war crimes committed by military and security officers. In its 2006 sentencing of Miguel Echecolatz, director of intelligence for the Buenos Aires Provincial Police, for conviction on numerous charges of kidnapping, torture and murder, an Argentine tribunal condemned the 1970s government's crimes as crimes against humanity and genocide of political dissidents. But the courts declined to prosecute the crimes of the left-wing guerrilla groups that, according to Argentina's Center for the Legal Study of Terrorism and its victims, killed or maimed some 13,000 Argentines. Carlos Marcelo Schaferstein in his work, Ciudadanos de Subversión en Argentina, Alejandro Garcia, and Antonio C. G.M. Robin have said that the Dirty War has long-standing roots. There was extensive leftist violence and police repression in Buenos Aires during the 1900s and 1910s that culminated in the tragic week of 1919, and the fighting that took place in Patagonia in 1921 and 1922, between anarchists and elements of the Argentine government forces popularly known today as the Patagonia Rebelde. Alicia Garcia, in her study of the national security doctrine in Argentina, also notes the government's use of paramilitary squads to smash labor unions during the 1919 Semana Trágica, and the mass executions used by the Argentine army in 1920 against the anarchist strikers in Patagonia as examples of Argentina's traditional way of dealing with subversives. In a brief memoir published in Panorama, Juan Perón acknowledged that the first Argentine military coup in 1930 had been prepared by the tragic week of 1919. Origin of the term. The term, dirty war, was originated by the military junta, which claimed that a war, albeit with different methods, was necessary to maintain social order and eradicate political subversives. This explanation has been questioned in court and by human rights NGOs, as it suggests that a civil war was going on, and implies justification for the killings. During the 1985 trial of the Junta'S, public prosecutor Julio Strasser suggested that the term dirty war was a euphemism to try to conceal gang activities, as though they were legitimate military activities. Although the junta said its objective was to eradicate guerrilla activity because of its threat to the state, it conducted wide-scale repression of the general population. It worked against all political opposition, and those it considered on the left. Trade unionists, students, intellectuals including journalists and writers, rights activists, and other civilians, and their families. Many others went into exile to survive, and many remain in exile today. During the trial of the Junta'S, the prosecution established that the guerrillas were never substantial enough to pose a real threat to the state, and could not be considered a belligerent as in a war. The subversives had not taken control of any part of the national territory, they had not obtained recognition of interior or anterior belligerency, they were not massively supported by any foreign power, and they lacked the population's support. Analysts say that crimes committed during this time may not be covered under the laws of war, which shield soldiery of inferior rank from prosecution for acts committed under military or state orders. Paul H. Lewis, professor of political science at Tulane University, who has written Guerrillas and Generals: The Dirty War in Argentina, is among those who claim otherwise. Terence Roregan is the prosecution of former military leaders in newly democratic nations. The cases of Argentina, Greece, and South Korea estimates that of the disappeared, at least 10,000 were involved in various ways with the guerrillas. Justice Minister Ricardo Gil Lavadra, who formed part of the 1985 Tribunal for the Trial of the Junta'S, later went on record saying, "I sincerely believe that the majority of the victims of the illegal repression were guerrilla militants." The Montoneros, in a statement issued in 1984, acknowledged having lost 5,000 guerrillas killed, and the Marxist-Leninist People's Revolutionary Army in 2007 admitted the deaths of some 5,000 of their own armed fighters. Mario Firmenich, the commander of the Montoneros, in a radio interview in late 2001 from Spain said that, in a country that experienced a civil war, everybody has blood on their hands. The government passed legislation to provide compensation to people who lost loved ones in the war under the dictatorship. To date, some 11,000 Argentines have applied for and received up to US $200,000 each as monetary compensation for their losses. The program of extermination of dissidents was termed genocide by a court of law, for the first time in the official treatment of illegal crimes of the dictatorship, during the 2006 trial of Miguel Echecolatz, a former senior official of the Buenos Aires Provincial Police.